Thank you so much. Thank you. That's so deeply appreciated. Thank you, Ellen, for that very kind introduction, my friend. Of course, this is a special conference for me in many ways. Obviously, the culmination of my year as president of the OAH. And I recall a few years back, I saw Richard White somewhere back there, former president of the OAH, dear friend and colleague at Stanford. And after he learned, and I learned that I'd been nominated to be in the queue to be president, he said, "You know what, it ain't honorary, my friend. It's a lot of work." And he's right, it's a lot of work. But Richard, it's an honor, nonetheless. It's special because we're here in San Francisco, right? One of my favorite cities of the world. And in the backyard of Stanford University and in my home in Menlo Park. And because of this location, it's special, especially wonderful for me because my family could be here with me today. My wonderful wife of 40 years, who I met and fell in love with as a 19-year-old sophomore at UCLA. She walked that academic career right next to me, and in life, so I couldn't have had a better partner. My children are here, and that's incredibly special to me. It's additionally really special because almost all of my former students and current students at Stanford are here this weekend, and they had a nice little session yesterday where they said nice things about the old mentor. I don't know what they said behind my back when we left, but they said nice things. And of course that makes it, all those things make it a special event. Before I begin, I just want a few shout-out thank yous. First, those of you who were in the business meeting, we did a round of applause for Kathy Finley, our executive director, and her staff. Kathy Finley is doing a marvelous job of moving this organization in the right direction. So Kathy, please stand up, and staff, stand up. This meeting runs so smoothly because of the staff. It's not because of folks like me. I also want to thank the program committee, especially the co-chairs that did such a wonderful job of bringing a terrific program to us this year. Erica Lee and Tom Guillermo and colleagues and friends who were on the program committee. So Tom and Erica and colleagues on the program committee, thank you very much. You did a great job. And as well, the friends and colleagues that volunteered to be on the local resources committee that structured and scheduled the various tours to have you go out from Hilton and experience San Francisco and all its treats. I also want to extend a thank you to the Department of History at Stanford and to the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, because they offered up quite a contribution to help us support a number of events that otherwise wouldn't have taken place here. So I'm grateful to my institution, my department, my school. And I'm grateful to the weather that we had. Kathy Finley and I, on Wednesday, were praying to the gods of the weather and saying, please bestow upon us this wonderful weather. And lo and behold, look what we've had, better than usual. So with no further ado, I'm going to keep you for a while. I timed this lecture, and at almost exactly 50 minutes. It's long, but that's what we're used to, 50-minute lectures, so bear with me. In 1925, Rose Lopez and her teenage friends occasionally attended the Saturday matinee features at the only movie theater in Compton, California, where she lived with her working-class Mexican immigrant parents and siblings. After she and her friends purchased their tickets at the window, they lined up for admission to the show, waiting for the usher to tear their tickets in half and then proceed to their seats. Seating in the Compton Theater in 1925, however, was segregated by race in this predominantly white city, a municipality where the only racial minorities of note were Mexican Americans. Though a small population of Japanese American truck farmers lived in the outskirts of the small city, Compton was a place that strictly enforced the exclusion of African Americans in neighborhoods in the first half of the 20th century. As the Mexican kids approached the usher, he pointed to the side entrances to the theater, and they obligingly followed directions to sit where, by customary practice, people of color sat, on the sides, away from the center seating area exclusively for whites. Rose had stayed back in the line away from her friends as they entered the side aisles, and when she approached the usher, she stated in perfect English, "Thank you very much, sir," and walked through the center aisle to claim her choice seat among the white patrons. Before the movie was projected on the big screen, she looked over to her friends seated on the far aisle, smiled and winked, and they winked back. Rose, a fully bilingual, light-skinned Mexican-American girl who could pass as white, had tricked the color line in Compton, a tactic Langston Hughes referred to in 1950 as, quote-unquote, fooling our white folks. Eleanor Ragsdale was the matriarch of a middle-class African-American family in Phoenix, Arizona, a city where a longtime black resident claimed the racial divide, quote, wasn't much different in the South. The difference here is they didn't lynch you, end quote. By the 1940s, African Americans and Mexican Americans lived in a city influenced deeply by the social mores of a substantial population of white Southern transplants, city leaders and common citizens alike, who formed part of a larger community in which a racial hierarchy was designed to separate people of color geographically within segregated neighborhoods of South Phoenix. The use of racially restrictive real estate covenants and codes of compliance among white realtors and homeowners prevented most brown and black people from residing in better neighborhoods with good schools. A real estate agent and a former teacher from Philadelphia, Eleanor was from a family of means. And though she and her husband could afford the new suburban homes sprouting everywhere in post-World War II Phoenix, these new homes and schools were off limits to blacks, regardless of their class status. Refusing to accept the status quo of residential segregation of blacks in the increasingly deteriorating neighborhoods of South Side, Mrs. Ragsdale consciously plotted to break the color line in the years following World War II. This African-American woman, who to some could easily pass for white, scheduled a meeting with a white realtor to view the home for sale in an all-white North Phoenix suburb. To help ensure that she could slip below the color line radar, she asked the realtor to meet her at twilight, and only allowed her dark-skinned husband to view the home at night as they drove by the property. She persuaded her reluctant husband to go along with her plan, enlisted the help of a white friend who purchased the home, and during escrow, transferred title to the Ragsdales. When move-in day arrived, Mr. Ragsdale stated the realtors, quote-unquote, wouldn't let me in. The Ragsdales won the skirmish over the keys to the home that day, but a battle ensued as they were soon greeted by a concerned improvement committee of polite white neighbors who insisted the black family wouldn't be happy in the neighborhood, offered to buy back the home. The offer was rejected outright, and the war of attrition between established white neighbors and new black homeowners was on. The family awakened one morning to find the word nigger etched on the line in on the lawn in large black letters, and soon the phone calls began. Hello? Hello, who is it? The only response was an angry voice. Move out, nigger. And these were repeated. Eleanor and Lincoln dug in their heels, determined to live in this new home in North Phoenix despite the intimidation. Indeed, Lincoln did not erase the racial epithet from the lawn in order to show the white folks the Ragsdales were there to stay. Clandestinely passing as white to gain entree as a homeowner in a racially restricted Phoenix neighborhood, Eleanor Ragsdale's strategy was to contest the color line and to help establish a beachhead for other blacks intent on securing better housing in a highly segregated city. Although hundreds of miles apart in distance and separated in time by decades, Eleanor Ragsdale and Rose Lopez were fellow travelers during an era when people of color accommodated and contested in a variety of ways the hardening racialized residential borders in cities and suburbs across the land. Their stories are a part of a larger and complicated narrative of how people of color navigated multiple color lines during the first half of the 20th century, an era that saw the rise and consolidation of racially segregated neighborhoods that characterized life in American cities. Between the extremes of people like Eleanor Ragsdale, who directly contested racially bordered neighborhoods, and the vast majority of people of color who did not, is a relatively uncharted social history a story about which historians and other scholars have contributed some important work over the past 2 decades. It is a history, I argue, best told from the comparative perspective, one that considers the context of particular racial groups in areas I refer to as the racial borderhoods of urban America. Racial borderhoods were the products of ideas and ideology about group differentness, ideas that were often channeled into policies and practices of exclusion that profoundly affected people of color. Comparing how different groups of people experienced efforts to keep them out of restricted all-white geographical areas and how they navigated racially sequestered life in American cities reveals many common features about the human condition and, at the same time, differences between and within groups, many of which I outline in this talk. The comparative framework I employ here is drawn from a book to be published later this year that considers the urban residential patterns of African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, and European immigrants in 17 cities, 7 industrial cities located in the north central and northeastern states, and 10 cities of the American Southwest. The focus of this presentation is on the first half of the 20th century, though the larger study examines patterns from 1850 to 2000. In an effort to understand more fully in broad stroke fashion the ways in which various racialized minorities navigated life in segregated cities across time and space, I offer 3 general categories that reflect many, but certainly not all, of the actions taken, desires fulfilled and unfulfilled, the dreams for a better life that millions of Americans yearned for in an era during which they found themselves increasingly confined to areas bounded by race. All 3 of these categories involve negotiating barriers, crossing color lines, passing color lines, sidestepping color lines. The great majority of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans in the nation's cities simply tried to make life livable for themselves and their families within the larger society that segregated them in neighborhoods, relegated them to particular types of jobs in the workplace, and denied them equal access to public facilities. Historians and social scientists have ably described processes of adaptation and accommodation for newcomers to urban America as fundamentally a search for stability and security. And I think that's right. That's what people were searching for, stability and security. The large volume of literature on European immigrants and African Americans in industrial cities describes the multiple ways different groups adapted their lives within the urban milieu. Although less has been published about Mexican Americans and Asian Americans, the urban histories of these groups describe similar phenomena associated with adjustments to urban life. Beyond the reasonably well understood histories about families, labor, social and political organizations, religious institutions, we know far less about the ways in which people adapted their lives in segregated settings by moving across color lines. Crossing a color line was an experience that most people of color encountered, but the ways in which they crossed varied greatly. Of course, examples of those who boldly contested color line boundaries as individuals or as members of civil rights organizations testing limits provide dramatic cases, many of which are well documented. But what about those who cross color lines with no intent of pushing the civil rights throttle forward? Or what about those folks who literally moved across color lines from city to city, hoping that the next move would bring better fortune, or at least less segregated, overcrowded, and oppressive housing conditions? And there were those who mistakenly or unknowingly crossed color lines, often with violent consequences for stepping over into contested racialized spaces. Even more in the shadows of history are the people of color who passed the color line, some temporarily and others permanently, the latter making decisions to break completely from family, friends, and communities of origin. Passing the color line also entailed fooling the white folks, such as the story of Rose Lopez, or experimenting with life on the other side, if just for a few hours. Passing the color line for others involved making decisions to conceal or modify cultural and ethnic identity in order to be accepted in a white world and to escape segregated neighborhoods and lifestyles. All of these forms of passing, first and foremost, required a color test. Only those with light skin were white enough to pass. For some groups more than others, language and cultural skills were nearly as important as the level of melanin in their genetic makeup. Lastly, navigating segregated life in American cities by the 1940s and 1950s took on a dimension in which youth of different ethnic and racial backgrounds ignored and flaunted color lines created or accepted by their parents. They intentionally sidestepped and straddled color lines. Thousands of young people engaged in taboo social behavior across racial and geographical boundaries as they encountered one another through the avenues of popular culture. Sidestepping, passing, crossing color lines were among the many options open to people for navigating segregated urban life, but they were not mutually exclusive. They were all conditioned and variably affected by what I call ideologies of differentness, practices and policies of exclusion, which I refer to as the Crow Cousins, and the formation of racial borderhoods. I'll explain these in a minute. Together, these three frameworks help explain not only the many options open to people of color as they experience life in their respective racial borderhoods, but they provide the context for understanding the host of disadvantages they experience during the apex of residential segregation based on race in 20th century American cities. Ideology of differentness involved much more than simply attitudes about race and skin color. I employ the term differentness purposely instead of differences, to claim that ideas about various groups in the American past pivoted around dominant societal perceptions, attitudes, stereotypes, and other thoughts that not only categorized some people as different, but were used in ways to make normative value judgments to rationalize and justify subordination on many fronts. Although ideas about group differentness were typically premised on conceptions of inherent or immutable dissimilarities and notions about inferiority and superiority, these ideologies changed over time as a result of multiple historical forces. From the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, several major characteristics or axes of differentness defined how various immigrant groups and domestic racial minorities were viewed by the larger society. These axes were fundamentally tied to ideas about cultural, religious, national origin, ethnic, linguistic, gender, and social class differences. But none of these axes were more insidious and durable than those based on ideas about racial differentness. And when multiple axes of differentness rotated or intersected or commingled, they had powerful consequences for shaping social relations, forging public policies, and influencing cultural practice. To be sure, axes of differentness changed during the course of the 20th century as some shifted away from groups previously maligned as their status in society correspondingly improved. Other groups had far greater difficulty casting off axes that defined them as qualitatively different. Ideas about differentness were altered by many influences, including international wars, changing political economies, foreign and domestic migrations, group demographic concentrations, and by changing intellectual paradigms about race, ethnicity, and culture. And just as a way to try to perhaps give a graphic portrayal of how I try to use these ideas about these axes of differentness, how they affect groups over time, to really explain change with groups over time in the course of the 20th century. So if we were to take this group, in particular Mexicans, now I don't know where that stereotype came from. In all my years, I have never seen a Mexican or Mexican Americans sleeping against a cactus. Can anyone tell me where that, I'd love to know. All right. So 1920s Mexicans, you have to understand, are caught in this vortex of the reign of scientific racism. And so that's what I outlined, that's why I specify here. Race color is going to define first and foremost how Mexicans and the huge volume of new Mexican immigrants coming into the country, how they're viewed, but closely aligned to class and culture, a lower class, a subordinate culture. They come from an undeveloped country, right? Mexico, they are Catholic. This group already has 3 or 4 strikes against them to begin. And if one were to look in terms of the gender analysis, we could parse out, again, differentiation of the ways Mexicans are viewed. But if we push forward to the 1940s, World War II and after, and I pick here the case of the image of a Pachuco in the Zoot Suit riots, being interrogated in 1943 during the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. Why would I emphasize culture more than race? A paradigm shift began to occur. The age of the concept or the pseudo-scientific ideas about scientific racism are in the decline, but we're seeing the emergence of a theory of assimilation beginning to define how ethnic groups and immigrant groups are incorporated into American society. So it's Mexican culture. It is deviant, young, especially males, but not exclusively males. Again, class and race are clearly aligned. Generation's important because it's the second generation, maybe even the third generation. And geographic concentration is important because they're primarily defined now as an urban population. Again, if we were to explore gender analyses or the analyses based on region or sub-region or even locality, these are parts of the way one would view the axes of differentness beginning to shift. And if we push it even further, just very quickly, civil rights movement, the Chicano rights movement, these axes of differentness by the group themselves are being turned on their heads. So ideas about culture, though the ideas about a deviant culture, a subordinate culture persist, the group itself is beginning to redefine these axes, but instead of a pejorative way, a positive way. Generation, you're talking about third generation demographic concentration, still urban barrios, but farm workers, because of the National Farm Workers movement, is gaining place. So, and then let's quickly move to this one. I don't want to, just want you to get an idea of how the way I'm trying to conceptualize these axes of differentness as they affect all these groups that I'm looking at over time. Think about Japanese immigrants here, women being lined up for probably processing Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay. Race, of course, in the age of scientific racism is the defining characteristic. But you can't talk about race exclusively because you have to talk about nationality, a culture, a different religion, and a different class. And there'll be variations how Asian women are perceived and men are perceived. But clearly race is going to be first and foremost the way Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans are going to be perceived. Then if you project forward to World War II, the racialized minority becomes the racialized hated enemy. So it adds yet another axis of differentness, which is going to, of course, end in an internment process for these groups. But nationality and culture and religion, so these are intersecting, if you will, axes of differentness. But think about the change here, and I'll project a generation later, relatively small population before immigration policies changed in 1965, very small population relative to other national minorities, African Americans and Latinos. We have culture which defines the group, but the pejorative, negative axes of differentness have shifted so dramatically for Japanese Americans and other Asian origin groups. So they've gone through assimilation process successfully. They've achieved social and economic mobility from one generation to the next. Race is no longer the defining factor, though it's an important factor. In fact, you get new axes, very positive ones. Model minority, though we know there's some problems with it's a model minority myth for certain groups. These are ways just suggesting how these axes of differentness, to try to explain it, it's really my purpose, try to explain the change over time for any of these groups. Ideas about group differentness may have been enough to keep people away from others they deemed inferior and categorically different. But when these ideas made their way into the realm of federal, state, and local policy, and informal social and cultural practices of exclusion were formally codified into law. So the ideas, when they make that leap to policy, have profound effect. The rise of Jim Crow in the South in the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction is a prime example. The color line that defined white-black relations in the American South, indelibly influenced by the legacies of slavery as an institution, operated on beliefs about African American group differentness, especially those about racial, cultural, and intellectual inferiority. Long-standing customary practices of separation of the races were augmented and systematically enforced through new laws in the post-Reconstruction decades, while the new constitutional rights and freedoms granted African Americans were denied and rolled back in the Jim Crow order of white supremacy in the South. And we know the iconic images of what Jim Crow created in a white, a starkly separated society in the American South. You've seen these before. Sometimes you sat in the back, sometimes you didn't. One of the great heroes, right, of the civil rights movement. And then the institutionalizing of Jim Crow at the educational level. So you have public education that is separate, but we know it's unequal. And these kinds of signs that you would encounter. The horrible atrocities that occurred, the violence, the terrorism, it's domestic terrorism, and the groups that fomented that terror. But what happened when African Americans migrated in great numbers to northern and western cities to escape Jim Crow and plant roots in new urban places? Did Jim Crow simply follow them to new destinations and shape their lives as urbanites? When Chinese immigrants settled in large numbers in San Francisco's Chinatown, not far from here, was their experience tantamount to Jim Crow for blacks in the South? When hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and their children occupied the sprawling barrios of southwestern cities in the first half of the 20th century, were their encounters conditioned by the same set of ideas and policies experienced by the nation's largest racial minority in the South? Not all racial hierarchies and policies and practices of exclusion and separation were created equal. Jim Crow had at least two cousins. Jaime Crow, who put Mexicans and Mexican Americans in their place in the Southwest, and James Crow, that despicable fellow who shadowed African Americans everywhere outside the South. I refer to these Crowisms as a way to understand how multiple color lines developed in 20th century America and how they applied to a diversity of racialized groups in different regions of the nation over time. Jaime Crow, by the way, translation from Jim, all right, no, nothing too cute. Jaime Crow was a structure of discrimination, exclusion, and separation in the Southwest that, unlike Jim Crow for blacks in the South, was not based fundamentally on state or local laws. Jaime Crow was anchored more by social practice and cultural customs, though institutional policies and practices did indeed arise to restrict opportunities and rights among Mexican Americans. It was a line that separated the great majority of Mexican origin people from whites, a marker drawn as much by cultural, religious, and national origin axes of differentness as skin color and ideas about inherent racial inferiority. By law, Mexican Americans were Caucasian, but Jaime Crow made them nominally white. How Mexican Americans navigated life in the expanding barrios of the Southwest provides examples of how a variation of Jim Crow affected the urban experiences of the region's largest minority. I'm going to show you a few slides most of you have never seen. If you were in Texas, South Texas, in the 1920s, you'd come up against this sign and say, "Este baño solamente para americanos." So this bath is only for Americans. If you were Mexican, you knew what Americanos meant. That was white. You knew you couldn't go there. You might come across a sign like this in a storefront window or a restaurant. It said, "We serve whites only, no Mexicans or Spanish." They got a little nuance with that one, Spanish. Or next door was a restaurant that said, "Se admite Mexicanos," Mexicans admitted. "Pasen a comer, come on in." Chile con carne, lunches y comidas. I'm actually getting hungry looking at this thing. Institutionalized Jaime Crow, usually not by policy, not by state law, but there are some exceptions. This in a predominantly Mexican American town in South Texas. This is the American school. This is the Mexican school. 80% of the population of that city is Mexican. This is a scene from, some of you may know, the famous Mendez versus Westminster case in 1947 in Orange County schools. Systematic separation of Mexican children in schools and in classrooms. Right? It's from Zoot Suit Riot, so there was violence, intimidation, terror, but never to this extent that African Americans experienced. And Selma, Alabama, no, Santa Barbara, 1921. The only group, only minority in that town of any number were Mexicans. The color line that Jaime Crow constructed to keep Mexican origin people subordinated was different than the omnipresent specter of Jim Crow that blacks faced daily in the South. One of the primary reasons why millions of African Americans fled their homeland during the First and Second Great Migration was to escape humiliating, oppressive conditions. Indeed, life in the so-called Promised Land, especially the cities of the North and West, held out greater relative freedom and greater opportunity for African American migrants. Gone were the constant daily reminders of their unequal status. The iconic figures again, the colored bathrooms, the colored drinking fountains, the colored theater seating, the colored seating in the back of the bus. In the cities to which they migrated, initially they typically lived among European immigrants and other poor working class people, oftentimes in uneasy accommodation. From New York to Detroit to Los Angeles, black urbanites headed to the cities in growing numbers to build new lives and communities. Between the world wars, however, African American life became increasingly segregated, especially in the neighborhoods that over time became less ethnically diverse. James Crow, a close cousin to Jim, extended his grip on black urban communities with greater force each decade into the 20th century. James, more subtle than Jim, was a less pervasive, less institutionalized, less codified, and less systematic form of discrimination and inequality. And although there are many race-related laws in northern and western states that sought to segregate African Americans, and urban blacks did indeed experience individual and collective acts of violence against them perpetrated by whites, James Crow was not based on that interlocking Southern-style web of local and state statutes reinforced by individual and group terrorism. Still, James Crow was about racial discrimination and creation of barriers, especially residential barriers, to restrict African Americans to increasingly concentrated urban neighborhoods. What African Americans experienced in nearly every city they inhabited by the 1930s and 1940s resembled in many ways what happened to Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans as they encountered American cities, especially in California, in the second half of the 19th century. Highly segregated urban residential life based on race. Chinatown, in this city by the bay, was a bordered neighborhood bounded geographically by surrounding neighborhoods that restricted the Chinese to a certain area of the metropolis. It was a product of ideas about Chinese racial, cultural, and religious differentness, some of which were codified by laws, and others that crept into real estate policies and practices in the 20th century that further separated Chinese from whites. Chinatown in San Francisco was the first racial borderhood in urban America. Borderhood. Why use this neologistic term? Why not simply use conventional terminology such as ghetto or ethnic racial enclave, or when referring to specific groups, employ terms as Mexican American barrio or black ghetto, or commonly used descriptors like Japantown or the Latin Quarter or the Negro District. Now, these terms, to be sure, are useful in labeling certain residential areas in American cities over time, but I argue they obscure a broader comparative understanding of the many historical forces that shaped ethnic and racial residential formations in 20th century America, because they tend to isolate and homogenize group experiences. So in other words, when we look at these particular labels that we apply to groups, they don't allow us the comparative dimension. When you step back to look at, as I have, these various communities across urban America, there are some interesting comparisons, but differences as well. The hybrid term borderhood borrows from the literature that describes and conceptualizes borderlands, geographical regions where social, cultural, and political forces shape the lives of various groups within bounded or bordered spaces. It also borrows from the term hood, used in popular cultural discourses over the past generation that refer to African American inner city neighborhoods, many of which are characterized by legacies of impoverishment, residential segregation, and isolation from mainstream society. Urban borderhoods were typically among the poorest residential areas of any city, and the nation's largest immigrant groups and domestic racial minorities were drawn to them for economic reasons, but also because family, kin, and others settled in borderhoods. They were urban spaces often bordered by neighborhoods of working class and middle class native-born whites and located in or near the most undesirable residential areas bounded by industrial plants or other workplaces where unskilled or semi-skilled work was available. Borderhoods were the places where adjustments to urban life played out for literally tens of millions of Americans. They were areas where multicultural ways of life flourished. They housed a multitude of people, some who spent their entire lives within the confines of the borderhoods, and others who, if the circumstances permitted, left them behind at the first opportunity. Several types of urban borderhoods formed in modern America. They were all greatly influenced by ideologies of group differentness, but some more than others were products of policies and practices of racial exclusion. 4 types predominated in the first half of the century, 2 of which I describe here. Multi-ethnic transitory borderhoods were areas constantly in flux as immigrants, native-born working class people, both white and non-white residents, moved in and out and between these spaces of the built environment. These multi-ethnic borderhoods were always in transition as a result of changing urban land use patterns affected by expansion or relocation of industry, retail districts, and the practices of real estate owners. The new immigrants from Europe and African American migrants to northern cities together occupied these multi-ethnic urban borderhoods in the early decades of the 20th century. Mexican and Asian immigrants in the West initially lived in multi-ethnic borderhoods as well. Between the 1920s and 1950s, most multi-ethnic borderhoods went through significant change. As European immigrants and their children achieved modest upward economic mobility and dispersed to newer and better housing in working and middle-class areas away from old neighborhoods in most northern cities, the once multi-ethnic borderhoods increasingly became racial borderhoods. A similar process unfolded in the cities of the Southwest for Mexicans, Asians, and blacks during the same decades. When European immigrants and their offsprings had the means to move beyond the multi-ethnic borderhoods to neighborhoods defined more by class than by ethnicity, they were free to do so. This was not the case over time for most residents of racial borderhoods. The options open to them to reside where they please actually grew more restrictive each decade into the 20th century, though variations existed by group, locality, and region. The geographical boundaries of racial borderhoods hardened as institutional policies and practices reinforced social distance between whites and non-whites. The ubiquitous use of racially restrictive covenants in the nation's urban housing markets by the 1920s and 1930s went hand in hand with federal home mortgage policies of the New Deal that introduced the redlining of urban areas deemed to be too risky for investment by the government. Together with the practices of white homeowner associations to keep people of color from entering their neighborhoods, and the harassment and intimidation some whites bent on containing racial minorities to particular residential areas and from certain commercial and retail establishments, a web of restrictions by race defined the social reality of people who inhabited the racial borderhoods of America. Largely poor people with few resources and few political advocates. Residents of the racial borderhoods were easy prey for landlords who made matters worse by charging excessive rent. At the same time, they fueled overcrowding by stuffing more and more families and individuals into subdivided spaces. Navigating life in the nation's segregated racial borderhoods took many forms. But for most, it involved decisions to make the best of difficult situations. Most residents of racial borderhoods understood their status as minorities in large white majority cities. They knew either through firsthand experience or through word of mouth or both which jobs were open or closed to them. They knew where they could go freely and not about the city, which streets or neighborhoods were contested and to avoid. Some accepted their situation and safely navigated social and geographical boundaries within and outside the borderhoods, always careful not to provoke conflict or to attract unwanted attention. Some harbored resentment, while others attempted to breach the racial divides that surrounded him. Wei Ba Liu, a resident of San Francisco's Chinatown in the early 1900s, knew the safety that his racial borderhood provided him from a hostile outside world and was regularly reminded about its racialized geographic boundaries. Quote, in those days, reflecting on his youth in Chinatown, quote, the boundaries were from Kearny to Powell and from California to Broadway. Sound familiar? Very close. He said this, if you ever passed them and went out, the white kids would throw stones at you. One time I remember going out, one boy started running after me, then a whole gang of others rushed out too. We were afraid of them, and there were more of them than us, so we would just come right back to Chinatown. Angry, he asked himself, well, maybe in those days when we were young, we were not so angry, just tired of it. About 40 years later, in a different city, Ed Peterson, an African-American resident in Chicago's South Side Borderhood, the so-called Black Belt, was also just tired of it. Commenting on the divergent socioeconomic paths of European immigrants and their children and blacks in Chicago, groups that had once resided in the city's multi-ethnic borderhoods, he reflected on his situation and that of other African Americans in the Midwest metropolis in a letter he wrote to the Chicago Defender in January 1942. He had this to say, the white immigrant finds his way to the top social ranks, though at one time he was a pal of the colored youth who might have lived in his neighborhood. Friends in childhood, in maturity, the white one lives in quiet, healthful suburbs, while the colored one lives in the dusty, dirty, restricted neighborhood and can never leave it, end quote. A few years later, in 1946, a similar refrain of resentment was uttered by a Mexican-American teenager, a second-generation resident of a segregated racial borderhood in Riverside, California, located about 30 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. Asked how he thought white Riversiders viewed the barrio that he lived in, he said, quote, sure, maybe it's picturesque to Anglo slumming parties who come here anywhere they wish. Maybe they'd feel differently if they tried it here for a while. I don't want to lose touch with my family, he said, but if I make any wages in the future, I'm going to leave this sinkhole, end quote. This young Mexican-American from Riverside, Mr. Peterson from Chicago, Mr. Liu of San Francisco were among the hundreds of thousands of people of color who lived in the nation's racial borderhoods during the first half of the 20th century. Most knew it was difficult to rent or purchase a home or apartment outside the boundaries of their respective borderhoods, but they routinely ventured out to other parts of the cities as consumers or as workers or for recreation. But here too, they were often reminded of the racial borderhoods that shadowed them. Whether in Chicago, Dallas, New York, Detroit, Phoenix, or San Francisco, people of color learned to navigate and cope with James and Jaime Crow. In many of these cities, one could indeed encounter a posting as they strolled through a downtown shopping district where a sign in a store window indicated white trade only. But more often than not, people of color knew personally or from others which retail establishments, restaurants, and movie theaters were off limits to them, and they simply avoided them. Quote, we know where we couldn't go, the places where we couldn't go, so we just kept out of them, recalled a black woman in San Francisco in 1940s after being denied service in a city restaurant. Wei Ba Liu had learned this hard lesson in the city by the bay many decades earlier when he attempted to rent an apartment on a street that bordered Chinatown. Quote, I had trouble finding a good place in Chinatown, he claimed. It was so crowded, everyone sleeping in double-decker beds, so I went up just one block to Powell Street and asked if there were places there, only to discover, he said, they told him no one had ever heard of Chinese living on Powell Street before. So we went back down to Chinatown, where all my cousins lived in one room, no bathroom, no kitchen. Mr. Liu naively attempted to cross the color line in search of better housing outside the racial borderhood of Chinatown. But social custom and accepted norms about race and housing thwarted his efforts. In other cities across the nation, other forces were at play over the next 3 decades that reinforced residential boundaries between whites and non-whites. When people of color sought to move outside their ever-tightening boundaries, they often encountered white homeowners associations bent on keeping them out of their neighborhoods. Deed restrictions and the unavailability of home mortgage financing all added to a culture of exclusion. an African-American family seeking relief from the increasingly overcrowded Borderhoods of South Chicago decided to purchase a home in a Hyde Park area of the city, a neighborhood where black servants and maids were allowed to rent apartments near the homes of their white employers. The family assumed this particular neighborhood was open to blacks, only to encounter immediately the Hyde Park Improvement Protective Club in 1908. The club devised ways to preserve the homogeneity of their neighborhood. They threatened to boycott any realtor willing to sell property to African Americans and any business that served blacks. They offered to purchase the homes of existing black homeowners and offered bonuses to black renters if they moved. In fear of the quote-unquote Negro invasion from the Southside Borderhoods, the Protective Club issued a manifesto to real estate agents and landlords. Quote, Negro residents of Hyde Park must confine themselves to the so-called districts. Negro residents of Hyde Park, the Negro districts that are now, the districts that are now white must, remain white, end quote. Unsuspecting black family moved on to an all-white street, thinking this was a place where it was an extension of an area where other African Americans lived. Next day, they were visited by club representatives who tried to persuade them to leave. They didn't. The next day, vandals broke into the family's home and shattered all the windows. The family was gone the next day. In city after city, homeowners associations formed to contain people of color within racial borderhoods. And when homeowners didn't formally band together, they engaged in individual and collective vigilante action against those who attempted to penetrate their neighborhoods. Intimidation, harassment, and violence, though not the rule, was nonetheless symptomatic of contested neighborhoods. These efforts were directed mostly, but not exclusively, to keep blacks out. These tactics were usually effective. Incidences of home bombings and threats of violence were enough to keep most black families from attempting to enter white sections. And these two slides are not too bright here. Circa about 1950 in Los Angeles, this African-American veteran of World War II, a bomb had been thrown into the home that he had recently purchased. Didn't kill anyone in the family, but devastated the home. And here, different scene. This white homeowner in a section of Los Angeles had decided to sell his home to an African American. He was quickly visited by all of his neighbors who were going to persuade him, one way or another, not to sell that home. More widespread than homeowner associations were the racial restrictive covenants and new subdivision restrictions which blanketed urban housing markets everywhere between the world wars. In Los Angeles, for example, between the 1920s and 1940s, 80 to 95% of all municipalities in the region were covered by such housing restrictions based on race. They became a daily fact of residential life in urban and suburban America well into the post-World War II decades. Adolf Soria, a former paratrooper who served during World War II, had saved enough money for a down payment and earned enough wages to afford a monthly mortgage payment for a home in Los Angeles in 1948. This ex-military man obviously believed he had earned the right to a piece of the American dream, or so he thought until he encountered a salesman for the new suburban home he wished to purchase. Quote, "We don't do business with Mexicans, buddy," the realtor stated bluntly. "This is a restricted community." In 1957, a Mexican-American father of 7, hard-working man, who had climbed the occupational ladder from construction day worker in the 1920s to a unionized cement finisher in the 1950s, ventured into Linwood, a suburb of central Los Angeles, to inquire about a lot where he envisioned building his new dream family home. He walked up to the real estate agent and asked in broken English about the lot, and the man, matter-of-factly but politely, replied, quote, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but we don't sell property to Mexicans here in Linwood," end quote. Mr. Easby Wilson, a black auto worker in Detroit, was doing fine economically, working the day shift at the Dodge plant. He lived in the notoriously deteriorated Paradise Valley racial borderhood of Black Detroit. Working with a realtor who assured him the resistance to blacks in white neighborhoods were decades past were no longer. He bought a home in a largely white neighborhood in 1955 where other Dodge employees lived in nice, modest suburban tract about 3 miles away from the plant. He could not have anticipated the level of resistance he and his family encountered. The realtor had not told him that the area just 2 years before was the scene of enormous tension over the so-called Negro invasion. The Wilsons experienced hell for 5 months. Vandals broke into the home the night escrow closed, plugged the sinks, turned on all the faucets, and sprayed black paint everywhere. Neighbors assembled, and crowds grew to hundreds with picket signs saying, "You better go back to where you belong." The next few nights, bricks were thrown through the windows and doors. The police were called, but they stayed in their cars while more vandalism occurred. Before leaving the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson stated, quote, "I don't know if it's worthwhile. I believe in democracy. I believe in what my husband fought for in World War II. They fought for peace. And I wonder if it's worthwhile," she said. "I have a question in my mind," she asked, rhetorically. "Where is the peace they fought for? Where is it?" Passing the color line was real, difficult, and dangerous for people of color. For some, however, if you couldn't cross it, perhaps you could pass under it. Pretending to be or passing as white is a little-known phenomena, but was an option for those with skin pigmentation and phenotypes that allowed them to do so. There were different ways to pass, and it was easier for some groups more than others. It was nearly impossible for Asian Americans to slip under the color line for obvious reasons, but for certain African Americans and Mexican Americans, it occurred probably far more than is documented. Like Rose Lopez of Compton, passing opportunistically and temporarily was fun and games and fooling our white folks. There were those who passed because they just wanted to taste a little bit of how the white folks lived or worked. But there were others who decided to pass permanently, and by so doing, rejected families, friends, and identities as people of color. Among Mexican Americans, there were those who were able to whiten themselves culturally and linguistically, especially if they had ascended to middle class status where money whitened, and they passed themselves as the higher class of Mexicans different from the masses of lower class. You will find in every Mexican American community, past and present, from San Antonio to Chicago to Los Angeles, those labeled Los Güeros and those labeled Los Prietos, light-skinned and dark-skinned Mexicans. The great range of skin color found among Mexican Americans is the result of mestizaje, or racial mixing, process that unfolded over 350 years in Mesoamerica between Spanish indigenous and African origin people. Once in the U.S., if you could shed your Spanish accent and leave behind your cultural baggage, Los Güeros, the light ones, had an opportunity to pass temporarily or permanently. Some did, and they successfully blended into white societies. Other Güeros opted to whiten themselves by discarding the term Mexican with all its historically pejorative associations and call themselves instead Spanish, a label that gave them a European whiter veneer. Los Prietos, the darker ones, did not have this option, and if they tried to pass, they usually didn't fool many people. Passing for Los Güeros brought privileges and opportunities. They could pass Jaime Crow easily and often. They were more likely than their darker-skinned counterparts to land retail jobs that entailed servicing white clientele. They were more successful purchasing homes outside the racial borderhoods because they were less conspicuous as new residents among the white neighbors, or they were more acceptable to realtors. Such was the case in Santa Monica, as reported by the president of the local realtor board there. Quote, "We are fortunate in Santa Monica with deed-restricted property," the president of the local realty board claimed. "But there are times when brokers go beyond the bonds of decency in selling property to objectionable nationalities as well as races. While there are isolated cases where the Mexican or colored people have gotten in, it's not worked a hardship. Personally," he concluded, "I place the Latin races in exactly the same categories as the color line," in referring to African Americans. A realtor in Compton in the 1940s did similarly with an African American man who could pass as white and sold him a home in an area of the city where a few other middle-class black families had recently broken the color line. It didn't take the white neighbors very long after the family moved in to see that the light-skinned man was not white and that his wife and his children were clearly black. Resentment and harassment of the family ensued, but was soon followed by panic selling among white homeowners leaving the neighborhood early in the process of a racial demographic transition. Passing in the city could also secure you better employment opportunities as long as you successfully concealed your race within the workplace. After feeding or sending her children off to school in Chicago's South Side borderhood, an African-American woman rode the bus, mostly with black passengers, to her job in city center. Reflecting on her grandmother's employment, Cheryl Harris recalled that no one at her job ever asked if she was black. The question was unthinkable. By virtue of the employment practices of the fine establishment in which she worked, Harris concluded, she could not have been asked about her race. 9 to 5 passing was part of the phenomena of temporarily passing under the color line, sometime to secure better employment and higher wages, and sometime to partake of leisure activities closed to non-whites. Despite the risks, adults of color who passed under the color lines either temporarily or permanently did so for practical reasons. Better employment opportunities, better housing, escape from the often stifling environment of the racial borderhoods was afforded those who could pass into the larger white society. But for tens of thousands of young people of color in the decades before and after World War II, sidestepping or straddling the color lines rather than passing was both possible and desirable. Popular culture was the vehicle through which African American, Asian American, and Latino youth navigated life that took them occasionally outside the racial borderhoods into multiracial settings, sometimes without their parents' knowledge, sometimes in spite of it. From the jazz age to the swing era into the early years of the rock and roll, youth of all races and ethnicities sidestepped color lines in pursuit of good times, music, dancing, and romance across forbidden boundaries. Everywhere in urban America in between the 1920s and 1950s, jazz clubs, dance ballrooms, and live band concerts drew millions of youth together in the same venues across color lines. The racial norms of society were sidestepped once youth took to the dance floors as interracial couples flailed their arms and legs to first the Charleston, later the jitterbug, and later yet to the sounds of rock and roll music. Oh, what their parents didn't know what they were doing. The jazz clubs in Harlem, South Side, North Side Chicago, and Central Los Angeles brought whites, first-generation European Americans, black, Latinos, and Asians together for the first time in large numbers into multiracial settings. But these spaces were usually located within the racial borderhoods. In some cities, officials moved to ban these multiracial venues, but in so doing, merely pushed out the musicians and their diverse followers to venues outside the central cities. Such was the case in Los Angeles in the 1940s. Renowned band leader Johnny Otis recalled, "If it were all Asian and Hispanic and black, they, the city officials, wouldn't care. But there were whites there, and they were mixing with the blacks and whatnot." End quote. Otis and other early rock and roll band leaders preferred the Almonte Legion Stadium, located in the San Gabriel Valley about 13 miles east of downtown Los Angeles. Quote, "We used to play a lot in Almonte Legion Stadium," a lead singer for a band recalled, quote, "and the audience were a good cross-section of whites, Chicanos, and blacks. I don't think kids today even think in those terms. It's common to see racially mixed groups now," he said. But that was the beginning of rock and roll, and they were all into the music. So they didn't care that the group and the audience was mixed. And this is, if you look at this, I can't tell from your vantage point, but this is an unbelievably diverse scene for around, the late 40s, early 50s. They're African Americans, Mexican Americans, Anglo Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese. So this was the venue that brought folks together in pretty amazing, dynamic ways. The venues for young people of diverse backgrounds who loved music and dance in the 1940s and 1950s were harbingers of change. After the structures that supported Jim, James, and Jaime Crow were demolished beginning in the 1940s, culminating in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the legal barriers that had long separated whites from non-whites began to fall. Correspondingly, the borders that the Crow cousins had built surrounding millions of people in urban racial borderhoods also began to crumble. First with the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 that made racial restrictive covenants legally unenforceable. And finally with Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act, that outlawed discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of real estate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The era of racial borderhoods thus came to a close by the late 1960s. ushering a demographic transformation of cities and their metropolitan suburbs in the decades that follow. But the phenomena of residential segregation by race and ethnicity, despite laws against the most onerous forms of discrimination, has continued in different guises since the 1970s. Today, most of the nation's largest cities and metropolitan suburbs are populated by majorities of minorities. Well, the stories of the people who inhabit what I refer to as the cities and suburbs of color in late 20th century America, or the early 21st century, be similar to or different than those from the era of the racial borderhoods? The answer to this question awaits the perspective of historians who study race and ethnicity in contemporary America. Thank you for your attention, folks.